I'm going to do the no new revenue bus scenario first.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So this is in preparation for the board meeting where the consultant will present to the board the new revenue scenario that you all saw at your last meeting, and then the final scenario of the community bus plan, the no new revenue scenario. So what would we do if we did not have a referendum or it did not pass? We're saving a few dollars by not having a consultant here. She'll be here for the presentation to the board. So this is, again, a reminder of why we're doing the bus plan. Again, it is to create a thoughtful, phased plan for any scenario that we might have and just be prepared. It's also designed to have an open dialogue with the public about our options. We have used a lot of the information that's already been completed. There's been a lot of technical work done, and there's no need to go and redo it, but there is a reason to refine the bus element of that and make sure that this is all integrated into what we're doing in Greenlight. And so here we are on target with this project in terms of our schedule that we are headed to an adoption at the end of the summer. And we do have, as you all know, and Brad will discuss in more detail, ongoing public and stakeholder involvement. Again, just as a reminder that we saw the optimal scenario in April, and that set our stage for our decision making. We agreed to the concept of how a new system would be constructed. And last month you saw the new revenue scenario. So what would we do if that 1 cent sales tax passes? What would that system look like in terms of frequency, those core routes? You see it on the map over there, that your changes have been incorporated in terms of additional coverage that you wanted to see. And today we're talking about the no new revenue scenario. And we have a couple options too, because this is a difficult conversation. This is the one where we have to start making some cuts from our current service, which is already underfunded. So today you've seen this before. We have 43 routes. Only 2 operate at 15-minute peak frequencies. And as we talked with the consultant, with Marie, and she talked about frequency and the importance of frequency and high ridership. The importance of frequency and spontaneous use, the importance of frequency when it comes to our fare box recovery. Again, this is the approach for the new revenue, looking at a core system with that supporting network. So now we have to look at ourselves today, where we are in terms of our major funding sources. Again, this is using the ad valorem as our local funding source for this scenario, and then our major cost categories. Again, these are things that you're familiar with. This is Brad's chart. You've seen this many, many times, but in the new discussion of the budget, we also know that changes in our expenses and changes in our revenue have allowed us to get 1 more year out of it at our current system. We're using those reserves in order to get that fiscal year 16, maintaining the system that we have. But in 2017, that's when we're going to have to make these cuts. So today, in order to keep a long-term balanced budget, because that is our requirement, we always balance our budget, is looking at our revenues and where they are and where they're projected to be, our expenses, and looking at 2017, what we would have to cut in 2017. And that's about a 15% cut, just if we were going to do it in 2017. And as you can see, every year after that, we would have to make additional cuts, which is difficult for the rider. So you want a system that is sustainable, that is something that they can rely on, regardless of what that is, that it becomes very stable. So in order to do a long-term stable cut, if we did a 28% cut, that would take us through 2023. So that's about 10 years from now, we would have a stable system for those last 7 years. That would also allow us to build up How we would do that, build up our reserves again, and then use them in the outer years. Again, every year trying to make sure that we're as efficient as possible. So as we start to look at that cut of 28% from where we are today in 2023, looking out, we want to also take a look at what the board has already agreed to in concept of what makes an efficient system. So the consultant has taken a look at where we could gain some efficiencies, where we could cut out some little bits and pieces, some deviations, streamline some of our routes, and we've talked about that. And we can still do that on top of this. We also talked about the grid, going to a grid network from the hub system. That is a big challenge when we cannot offer the frequencies that we would in the new revenue scenario. But there's three maps that I'm going to show you today. The first one is, what does it look like in year one? Understanding that we would not cut revenue hours, but we would just streamline those routes. So in areas where we have 3 routes coverage, we might change that to 2 and increase the frequencies on those. This would give us a restructured network frequency. So again, putting 15-minute service on some of those core routes. This is the first step to whichever path we're going to take or be forced to take come November of 2014. So we would have some opportunities for 15-minute service. This sets us up very nicely for our TDP and what a likely scenario would be for at least the first few years, next few years, 2014 and 2015. Now looking out into the future, we're to take that year one system that we've made some efficiencies to and decide how we're going to make the cuts. Are we going to focus on the core system, which again would allow us to have a lot higher frequency on those major routes, maybe be eligible for some other capital improvements for those routes, or are we going to look at just coverage? And if we look at coverage, that means lower frequency. It may also mean a lower fare box recovery, because if you have a 15-minute service on your core, but then you're forced to put a 30-minute service out there because you have to allocate it to somewhere else, these are the trade-offs that we're going to have to talk about. So what does that look like? This is the system map. And you have these maps, and I printed them in color on purpose so you could look at them. And we'll have some slides where they show side by side so you can see it. So this would be in 2023, if we focused on the core, this is what we would have in terms of the coverage on the system. This is what the route network would look like. You notice we don't have those gray circles anymore, those community circulators. So the community circulators, if a community wanted to have that, we would really have to partner with folks for that. We'd have to find another way to fund those. And again, this is what the frequency looks like. Now, and it's very similar to that first year, except remember we're taking some routes out. So in that supporting network, we're removing some of that supporting network and maintaining the core in this. We would have some Sunday service, but it would have significant reductions. So this is our next option, looking at coverage. We maintain the coverage of that year one scenario. We're not able to provide the same frequency on the core. So again, this is when frequency equates to ridership and to fare box recovery. We might lose that in favor of keeping some of the routes on the roads that they are today. So this goes to 30-minute service on our core routes. That's not even as good as we have today on some of those core routes on 4th and Central. This does also mean no Sunday service. And remember, the things that people are asking for are weekend service, and they're asking for expanded span of service, so late night and early morning, as well as frequency. And we know that that's really what we should be providing. So just that you could see these a little bit better, I put them on the same screen because it's hard to flip back and forth. So on the left you have, if we keep the core focus is on the left and the coverage focus is on the right. I think a more telling story is this. You see a lot more frequency on the, so what we do here on the core focus, we do better. On the coverage focus, while it has its benefits, we may not be doing anything really well. So again, we've talked a little bit about these trade-offs, and you know, it's a difficult conversation to have about what you want to keep and what you want to take away. But there's no question that in this no new revenue scenario, somebody's going to lose. So if we can have a conversation about the options that I've presented. Again, we have a year one, which is the first few years, and then these 2023 options would be what we would go to starting in 2017. So we'd start implementing one of these options in 2017.
Would you just go to the next slide, just to make sure we understand?
Yep.
Both of these maps here depict a 28% cut, a 28% reduction in total service from what is out there today in real life. Both of them do. There are two ways to cut the service, both dramatic. Core means a whole bunch are focusing on just a handful of routes, those dark blue lines. Just a handful, and it's hard to see, but there's a whole bunch of light blue lines that are eliminated on the core through a lot of Clearwater and down in St. Pete. If you can see that. There's many fewer routes under the core scenario. We cut whole routes. Whole neighborhoods and cities and areas don't get any service because we're concentrating them on the highest few. Actually, Ms. Hazelden here in the audience, that's somewhat analogous to her suggestion. Core. Get rid of the lowest ridership route and try to maintain some level of frequency. It would be less than under the revenue, but on just a few routes. It probably maximizes ridership. Ridership is going to be substantially less than it is today, but it would have more riders. It certainly is not a publicly appealing option. At least in my years of experience, it's not a politically appealing option at all to many political people that I've never met. Coverage keeps some service as many places as we can, but spreads it out incredibly thin, hourly service, kind of like what we have today, but even less. Coverage tries to keep all the routes going down as many streets as we can, but there will be lower because the frequency will be low. We have to totally eliminate service on Sundays. I know this to be a truth. The only community over 200,000 population that does not have mass transit service on Sundays is Topeka, Kansas. We can join Topeka in that option. We didn't have it in Des Moines, and that became a big thing. They were like, we are not Topeka. So that's why I know that. But so I just wanted to make sure that's understood, that neither of these two are both the cut. There are just two ways to cut it. Eliminate routes and concentrate on a few routes, or keep most of the routes. They're different though. They're different than today. These are cuts compared to the consultant's recommendation on how it would be better to optimize the whole system. We wouldn't keep the system of hub and spoke that we have today. We would go to this new system per the consultant recommendation, and then we would just have a much reduced level. at least in my recommendation, or when and I've just had a very limited time in reviewing these maps myself, I'm not so sure that we would go down this road of a low frequent grid-like system where but it might be better just to keep the system we have today, and then cut 28% out of that, but still have Williams Park and Grand Central and Park Street and Clearwater and Countryside Mall be hubs for the service, because it makes the transferring very difficult for riders if the bus comes every hour, and if they wait out there for a long time for the one bus and then they want to transfer to another bus that's not timed.
Yeah, but even with the core
Really
focus
hurt riders.
option, you would still have more hubs than you do with the new revenue scenario. There are some areas that you still could not go to the grid system, even in the core, because it's just not frequent enough on that supporting system. So you'd have to make some compromises there. Now, the real answer is probably somewhere in between, but there's, these are the options right now.
And not to jump in front of the group here, but just based on your set, are you saying it's an either or are you saying there's an option to maybe combine both? Or?
Well, it's just a finite pool of hours and
Yeah,
how you put that together.
So there's probably several options of how you really put it together, but for purposes of looking at it in a defined way today, you're not necessarily saying it has to be coverage, it has to be core, but in the group of PSTA, we have to sort of decide which is a little more important than the other before you create a final.
I see it
Sort of
as
a
a sort
policy.
of
A final, yeah, what's the base of our policy, and then you'll take those things and combine it the best way you can.
And I would see it as a spectrum of,
Mhm.
you have bookends of options.
Right.
And you need to decide which, which
Out of
end
the 10
the
things,
spectrum,
which is our
yes.
priority. Okay, so questions and comments from the board? Bill?
Let me make sure I understand. On the two that you show up here, the core focus has no Sunday service, but it's still a grid system.
Okay.
It's more of a grid system than what we have today.
Right, it is more focused on the grid service, but it does have some Sunday service.
Oh, it does?
The core has some, the coverage has none.
Oh,
And again, that's,
I got that.
That's a spectrum,
Mhm.
you could have, this is like a kid's party balloon, you squeeze one end, and all the air still stays in the balloon, you just have to decide where it's gonna go.
okay, so the core has some Sunday system, some Sunday, and it's more of it still would go to more of a grid than what we have today.
Yes,
The one on the right, the coverage system has no Sunday service at all.
right.
And is it still more of a grid than we have today?
But the coverage?
Yes.
No.
Oh, yes, it changes the routes.
It changes the routes, it streams like the routes, but you still have to go into those hubs. So it won't be as many on-street connections. There will still be some rerouting.
So it's an optimized existing system. There's
Yes,
some
yes.
improvements, but it just drops the frequency.
Right. Because remember, in the year one scenario, from where we are today to the year one, which is just same revenue hours, just reallocating, we're cutting out little deviations, we're maximizing some of the routes, we're preparing for the grid system. So we're taking 3 routes that serve the same travel market, maybe at 30-minute service, and creating 2 at 15-minute service.
So the coverage is as if we had them come in and say, optimize our existing system and still provide the coverage, that's what they would.
You said that this is the year, we've done our maximizing efficiencies first. That's absolutely, we're gonna do that. That's the year one scenario. Then in the coverage scenario, just the frequencies drop and Sunday service goes away. In the core focus, we maintain the frequencies, but eliminate routes to maintain those frequencies.
So, you showed some earlier slides, don't go to those, but you showed some earlier slides that talked about streamlining, and they looked a lot like that. If the referendum does not pass in November of 2014, we would not cut 28% immediately. No, I'm trying to confirm. We would implement the consultant's recommendations, subject to the board approving of the plan. We would implement the streamlining in 2015. We would streamline the routes, not do the 28% cut. Then, when our reserves run out in 2017, hopefully we can identify efficiencies and whatnot to keep moving that as far out in the future as possible. But we would, when we had to make the 28% cut, we would, but so then it would be a cut to a streamlined system at that point. That makes, I think that, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so then it would be this. So there would be, it would be an optimized system at whatever level of funding we have. Okay, I didn't know that.
Okay, other questions?
I had one. What is the costs will seem to be rising at a fairly precipitous rate. What is the percent increase in cost that you're assuming?
I think it's 4% increase annually. That's what we put in the model.
And revenue?
Is that a 1.6%
Increase?
total?
Property values?
For property values, we use the county and then fares, and I mean that green line looks like it's relatively flat. It goes up by I think an average of about 1.6%.
Can you repeat that? The cost assumption is goes up about how much per year?
4.
And the revenue one goes up 1.6 projected out. Does the revenue increase assume some ticket price increases?
We have ticket prices, we have fare, an examination of fares, I think it's every 3 to 5 years.
And the cost increases are principally, if I recall, medical expenses? Is that our insurance?
Oh, why is it 4%? Why is it
Yeah.
4%? Go
Well,
ahead.
one of the difficulties in this is that we are, the consultant, based on our input, used some assumptions to develop their hours of service we can afford and all that, that I think used a straight line 4%. Didn't get into the details of what's causing the 4%. We validated that number and that they used that. And then they assumed in the revenue side some fare adjustments at increments of time to get their number. Mike Hansen, our budget director, and I have been just this week looking at it from a different perspective of our actual budget and how it's projecting out. And that came up at the last board meeting with a question from, I believe, Commissioner Welch about the red line and why it's, how we might be able to mitigate that cost increase. It actually is surprising, well, not surprising, but difficult to adjust that number, because what Mike has determined is the the vast majority of PSTA employees are unionized employees that are subject to a union contract that includes what are called step increases. They start at $10 an hour, and then over how many years?
5 years.
No?
Six steps.
6
There's
steps.
7 steps, so over 6
Seven, okay. 6 years, they go from approximately $10 to $20 an hour. Those steps, regardless of any board-approved percentage increase in wages, those steps is about a 2% increase every year off the top, just to pay the steps. So then if you assume anything more than, well, if you assume a 1% pay increase across the board forever, every year 1% only, you're at 3 right there, without doing anything else. Without assuming fuel increase or health insurance or anything else, it's tough to get it down to 3.
I'm sorry,
3%.
I have to interject here. You're assuming that other costs don't go down or anything else when you say that.
That's right. Right.
So you can't, I mean, I know it's a simplified conversation in what you're trying to say, but you can't assume that everything else remains the same and that a 4% from
Right.
here to 20 years from now includes 2%.
Right, and in fact, we're trying
and
to
1%.
now go back into our budget in more details and look at those other expenditures, like maintenance parts and things, and see if really, I mean, a lot of those aren't, at least during the bad economy, haven't even been growing by inflation. Some have gone down, technology, but I'm saying, in order, when you look at the whole budget, those amounts in total are such a small proportion of the total. Some 70% is wages and benefits. It's just like your cities, similar. So much is in the wages, and the wages are subject to the union agreements. I mean, unless we really got rid of the steps, or not, our probably totally change our pay structure, the number will go up by 3%, even if everything else in the entire budget did not go up. It is just a challenge to change that red line on the long-term perspective.
The change in the yellow, the red line where it dropped down, that took into account that we would not need as many buses, we would not need as much maintenance, because we have less vehicles for the less hours of service.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
It dropped total expenditures by 28%. And the consultant has done an analysis of that. You'd say you've cut expenses by 28%. That is going to show savings in maintenance and customer service and operator wages and benefits. They've done some level of analysis on that and have generated, okay, at the end of the day, how many fewer buses, how many fewer miles of service and hours can we afford? And that's what these maps show.
So that's the drop down, but then we've kept the revenue increase, or the cost increases, the 4% assumption for everything else once we've dropped down to that level.
Right. Yes.
And yeah, I'm not sure that we could live with that, because then we're just going to be another, 6 years out, and we're going to have to go through it again. Unless we can get that cost increase in line with our revenue increases.
Right.
Which is, so this wouldn't be sustainable for more than 6 years or 5 years.
That's right. I mean, so what I would recommend doing is sort of what the agency has done over the last 5 or 6 years. do that again, cut 28%, which is more than we would have to cut. We would have revenue, but we would build up a reserve as we looked to a new system, a new system where we could have a sustainable expense rate and revenue rate, whether that goes to a different type of sales tax again or not. It would just buy the agency time to come up with a new plan. You're right. I mean, we have to find ways to have a sustainable revenue and expense stream and expenses as low as we possibly can make them. But I mean, and we're looking at this from a long-term perspective. Of course, we do need to be looking at ways every line item in the budget to find out savings. I mean, we have identified savings this year that we didn't identify. Like one example is we're going to contract out the lawn mowing, or as we looked at it recently, just not mow the lawn. But that is saving us some money that we didn't count on.
There's a lot, there's so many factors in this that you just can't do in a study like this, where, you know, you could get down so far down in the weeds in terms of which buses are we going to keep and which ones we aren't, and are we going to keep the younger ones? We could, you know, are we going to have, how are we going to manage staff through attrition? Well, okay, well then that's this many people at this level and into this step, and you know we lose this many percentage of people without, you know, within the first 6, you know, how many months of, you know, drivers. I mean, you know, there's things that we do on a year-to-year budget that you wouldn't do at a 10-year projection. You know, this is a snapshot of where we could be. This might be 2023, it might be 2021, it might be 2026. You know, I mean, that's because of changes and other things that we can do in the process, or things that we, you know, that we're not accounting for, you know, a catastrophe of some kind where we have to rebuild. You know, I mean, and I'm not saying that we should, I'm just saying that there are so many variables in this that this is a conversation starter.
The point I was trying to make is we implemented a strategy of a property tax increase, one-time property increase, that would get us to a sustainable level over until 2014, essentially. And we're projecting doing that again, and I'm not sure that we should do that again. That building up reserves and then drawing down, I think, is fundamentally flawed for any continuing organization. Maybe a one-time thing, but I'm not so sure we even should have done that in retrospect. And so I'm concerned about trying to replicate that in the future, and it sort of goes dying a little each year, maybe, instead of a sawtooth death, where you go and then. Thank you.
Just to clarify, the projected drop in ridership would be greater under the coverage focus scenario. There'd be a ridership drop with both scenarios, but I'm just curious about the assumptions and why the coverage drop would be greater than frequency. I mean, I know it's a little bit obvious, but I'd just like to hear you explain that a little bit more.
Because of people's expectations for when they go out and they meet the bus. Frequency as a behavior, frequency, people will more likely use it. If they only have an hourly service, they're more likely to find another way so they don't have to wait. It's that assurance that the bus is going to be there in a timely fashion. It's that consistency and confidence. But that's in all the travel demand models, it's always frequency, and that those are all calibrated to today's behavior.
Another big thing is you're losing a significant market because you're not covering a lot of markets where people are. So you're not serving them, so you're losing a draw of people.
So would it be reasonable to kind of characterize this as we can look at a scenario where we can focus on smaller, more frequent routes that we do really, really well versus a coverage emphasis where we spread ourselves thin, but we're not able to deliver services according to what people really want?
Yeah, no, and I hadn't talked to Brad about this yet, so you might disagree, but this is why I stand over here. Is I think in terms of what the board needs, in terms of decision-making, I think the decision is year one. I think we need to have the information, have the conversation about the core versus coverage, and be able to talk about it with people. But I don't know if the board has to make that decision today.
Yeah.
Just a couple of questions. What are you using to determine the core? Is it the current ridership? It's what you're seeing
right.
now, the best routes, et cetera.
Right.
Okay. And then I saw something on one of your slides, and I didn't want to interrupt your presentation, so it's a little question, but I think I know the answer. You show the North County trolley as a local connector service versus a trolley service. It's on a different slide.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
is
you know,
it-
I
is it
noticed
doing
that in
both?
the maps,
Yeah.
and that is, you know, in the new revenue scenario, we split them, so
Yes.
you could see both colors.
Right.
And this is a mapping issue that I think we need to solve before the board meeting. And
So
that
is it
it's
still a
layered
trolley
underneath.
service?
Yes, but it's layered service, and it's a mapping issue, not a service issue.
So is there
Yeah,
still a trolley there?
right, this trolley is underneath.
Okay.
They should be side
Just
by
checking.
side, but yes, that mapping issue.
I think, I think some information that we should put together, as well as, not just for us, but for the board, is what assumptions are in general, not, down in the weeds assumptions, but what assumptions are we using for revenues, expenses, maybe what's causing certain things of that, and whatever else you determine to be suitable. Assumptions, I'm just going to say assumptions. I think we need to see that because on the other scenarios that we're looking at, optimal,
New revenue.
new revenue, we spent a whole meeting talking about the assumptions, and we all came in agreement to what assumptions we were using. As a matter of fact, you went to all the other agencies and groups and got buy-in from them as well, which was the AA plan, whatever those assumptions were.
Right.
So there was buy-in on the assumptions, and first thing you heard today was, what are the assumptions? These assumptions are different than that, okay? So I think you have to approach this the same way.
Okay.
I think we have to have the buy-in on the assumptions. I mean, I understand,
I agree.
I totally understand what you're trying to show us. You're trying to get to the quick core of this is what you're going to be facing with no referendum.
Right.
You're just trying to get to the point, and that's fine. But I think you've got folks like us, as well as some other folks, that are going to ask those same questions. So
Yeah.
I think getting the same buy-in, because we may be faced with this.
Right.
And we need to honestly approach it and make it an honest plan, and I think that's what you're trying to do. So that we know and feel comfortable, for a lack of a better word, as to what direction we're gonna go in, no matter what happens.
Yes, and you are, for lack of a better word, you are choosing a vision.
Yes. So we
and
have to
we can still
understand.
talk about how we go from today to this, whether that's a one-time cut or,
Right.
you know,
And again,
Whatever.
I think you're right, it's the vision, it's the high level, but just as with those other plans, what I felt, just from my experience in looking at other things that you make decisions on all through government, the biggest question always is, what are your assumptions, whatever the issue is.
Right.
And so I think you've got to, even if it's in a mini way, high level mini way, I think we have to have everybody's buy-in on what the assumptions are.
well, I think anything we put, any model inputs that we have, we can put on a page. It says
Yeah.
assumptions, because we made assumptions about our federal funding. We made assumptions
Exactly.
about our local funding. We did, you know,
So to me, there's
Yeah.
two things, just, because I'm thinking about when we go to the board, when
Yes.
you all go to the board with this. I mean, that's the purpose of this committee, is to vet it and think about what they're going to want to see and what other people are going to want to see,
Exactly.
not just our own personal opinions.
Yeah.
So to me, there's two things. It's the assumptions, and it's, not that you didn't do it, you did,
Yeah.
but understanding the questions we've got here is
Yeah.
that what you're looking for from this committee and/or the board, and whoever you present this to, is what is their vision of, do you want to lean towards core, or do you want to lean towards coverage? Because it won't be an extreme of either, I'm sure. I'm sure it's going to be some combination or some merge. But you need to know what do you
Direction.
think the base parameter should be?
Right.
That's the information you're looking for.
Yes.
Because the answer of the assumptions of what's acceptable by the committees and the board, and the answer of what the vision is towards core or coverage, gets you to a place where you could actually create something, a real plan, right? So those are the two questions. So having said that, my personal feeling, if I go back to when we started the conversation on the bus study, just having the bus study, our conversation was, if we blew it up and created it again, what would it look like? And I think it's still the same conversation. I'm not saying in extremes, you know, and I want to get your feedback on it as well, but that was, to me, from the previous administration to this administration, the biggest plus conversation I thought PSTA had had. Because you do want efficiency, and if you only have so much money, you do want to make what you have the best it can be. But you don't want to lose sight of, you know, what public transportation does either. So how do you balance that? And so I tend, not in an extreme way, to lean towards core. Not, 100%, extreme. But I think if we have to live within, our 0.73 or 0.75, whatever, and don't forget, property values are going up. They're gonna go up. Not in extremes with the way things are, and hopefully we will start doing things like financing instead of paying cash for everything, and making our intergenerational, our projects and our capital projects, buses, intergenerational as they should be. I mean, there's still opportunity to grow the system, not a lot, but so however we do it, it should be efficient, whether we have this much money or this much money.
Right.
So that's just
I agree.
where I tend to lean. I certainly don't want to leave people who are largely dependent on public transportation out in the lurch. But just tend to lean, if we blew it up and wanted to start over, let's make it right. And so as we build, we're building off of something that works. So those are my comments. I don't know, I'd love to hear what the rest of the committee's comments are.
I'm just wondering how we're going to use these maps. It looks a little bleak, and it certainly, if this is something that we should show to the public so that they understand the implications of not passing the referendum, so they can understand it. And if we were to do that, I would probably, in the coverage map, maybe put in red lines on the routes that would disappear, so that people would understand what they're going to lose. If I had to make a choice, I would go for the core system. And that is based on, we have all these discussions of land use and so forth. And assuming that if we were to put in a light rail, that populations would grow around where the light rail is. And my assumption would be that if people are dependent upon buses, then they would move towards areas where they could get the bus, which is kind of hard-hearted, but that's what you'd have to assume. And if you've got very light usage, and I guess this is maybe another map, but you get an idea of how light the usage actually is on some of these, so that it seems more like you can get a feeling for the fact that these are just being run for very few people at this point, if that is in fact the case. But again, I think that if we're going to have a system, we're saying, going back to what Julie is saying, go to what is really how we would have it if we were to restructure it right now. And I think that build it and they will come. If you got to use the bus, then you got to move to where you can get the bus. And that's the assumptions we've had for building it. That's all
I don't have too many elaborate comments, except that I am leaning towards the core focus as well. It just seems to make sense to focus in a scenario of limited revenues and cuts, to focus on a few things in an excellent way rather than spreading ourselves too thin in the coverage focus scenario. I'd have to give it a little bit more thought until and how we would present this to the public, but it seems fairly simple to me. If the referendum does not pass, we're dealing with 28% cuts, and that means we have a Sophie's choice of cutting frequency or coverage, and I think it would be the PSTA's responsibility to explain, A, what does this mean to you if you use the bus, and also what does it mean to you how does this impact you if you're not a user? How would this affect your business, or how would this affect traffic on the road, or how does this affect our ability to attract new jobs and businesses with a even more hampered mass transit system? So, that would be like the broad things I think in terms of.
Now, this is going to the board next week as an information item. So again, no actual decisions, just a conversation, so that everybody can have a chance to think about it.
I think if you can, I think I know it's short notice, but I think you should include some assumptions in that conversation. You don't have to include everything and maybe say, next time we talk about it, it's gonna be, we're gonna have more, or, I just think, I know that's gonna be a peppered question, and it's going to take away from what you're really looking for. What you're really looking for is, what is the vision? Do you wanna go to core, or do you wanna go to coverage? Do you wanna lean towards core or lean towards coverage? That's really the answer you're looking for. But I know with the minds that we have, it's all going to be, well, how did you get here? And I think that's important.
We have that, we just need to
Okay.
put it on a slide. So I think that's in terms of our broad assumptions, I think we can get that together for the board meeting, not a problem. The question becomes, when do you make the decision of that first year? Because again, that's the decision that's really before this board, this year, this time, is how would you take the hourly revenue hours? Are you okay with us taking the revenue hours and putting these efficiencies in? So we can start to move towards that grid system. That's the decision. The other one, I think, is a public conversation.
I've just got one final observation. If we have, the consultants have determined that with the core system, we would have higher ridership. In a lot of ways, that just answers the question of how do we serve the community best. It's where it's going to be used. If it's setting something up that's not going to be used, that doesn't make much sense.
Well, and that's been one of the reasons we had our bus study to begin with. And I always say this, I'm not being literal when I say it. It's probably a soundbite somewhere, but along the way we added bus stops for somebody's grandmother. I say that, as an example, not that we've literally done that, but the coverage, leaning towards coverage, just continues that way of thinking. And the whole reason we had the bus study was to say no.
Right.
Live within your means, but provide great service. We are not an organization, our bus system right now, what do you hear? All I see is empty buses, and it takes me too long to get somewhere. So that's a level of,
Misconception.
no, it's not misconception. It's reality, but I don't want to use the word mistrust. I want to use the word of lack of confidence in how we are operating, because we are spread. We aren't doing the best of our ability in the route system that we have now. And so to continue on that path, or even to put that out there as a no revenue scenario, seems a little disingenuous to me. If we're going to do a study, we want to make it better, let's lean towards, with whatever revenue we have, to continue on going to a system that is sustainable and that we can obtain the confidence of the public that we are doing the best we can with whatever it is we have. Whether it's, a huge amount each year or a tiny amount each year, whatever we're doing as any business would. So to me, that's why I would want to steer this way. Bill, did you have any final comments?
Two things briefly. We are saying, or we're seeing that we have a change in the land use patterns within our county. We're seeing that there is more emphasis on smaller areas with higher density. There's people that love that. And so I would ask the question of what option or coverage would support that more. Conceivably, we go back to just having circulators in a few areas and not run the long routes. The other thing that I think is a core question is, how can we long-term have a situation where our expenses increase more rapidly than our revenue for the future. And if we can't solve that, we're going to go out of business sometime. Maybe we should decide how we collapse the system to something that is sustainable.
So, before we make I think we should make a vote of what we recommend to the board, correct? Or is it just information?
But then the public comment.
No, I'm gonna do that, that's what I said before. I'm gonna get the public comment, but
Yeah,
what are you
this was
looking
an
for from us?
This was an information item, and I hear what you're saying, and there was no action planned.
This month.
This
So
month.
when it gets presented to the board, you don't
It'll
want
be
us to
revised
say.
from this.
Right, but you don't want us to say that we're, I don't think I heard what Bill was leaning towards, but that we're leaning
I hear
towards
is
the core
it's not
system, that we're leaning towards some version of the core system. You don't want us to say that at the board meeting at this point? I mean,
No, what I hear, I think they're very valid comments. That, and frankly, my opinion is this is not the question to ask the board. The answer to the question on the test is core. It is not covered. But I gotta check this, but I don't think there's a system out there in America that looks like core. Topeka, Kansas, and Wichita, and Des Moines, and everywhere, they get coverage because everybody.
because it's a public transportation.
It's a public transportation system, and I cannot, yes, you say empty buses is one thing we hear, but we also hear you have no service ever in North County, and we're all paying the tax. We have no service, we have hardly any service on the core in Dunedin, and you will come and say, I'm paying, all my people are paying the tax, and we have no buses there. Coverage is what happens. It's not something that PSTA uniquely did. So I don't think this is the question. We will try, I mean, the planners want to go core, want the highest ridership, but that's not, as you know, the PSTA board went through a whole goal-setting process. Ridership is not our one and only goal.
Right.
It's not even a goal. Just the total number of ridership. It's a different question than that. Then the second, so I think.
What is the question? If that's not the question, what is?
Because I think
vision?
what you describe is more the path we need to take, where we talk about the assumptions, the assumptions that lead to this, and then talk about sort of what Mr. Johnson's describing, is this long-term strategy of revenue and expenditure, and if the referendum does not occur, what do we want to do? Sort of in a long-term plan. We show this, but we recommend, maybe not by next month, we probably do want to have some discussion of the core versus coverage. But ultimately, when you're asked to vote on this in August, there's one map. There's one staff recommendation, and it's a blend. It's a blend of those two. Probably trying to emphasize core as best we can, but not as draconian as two options.
Sure.
And that's not the recommendation. This is, in August, you're going to recommend the entire bus study. So that'll be the first time that the PSTA board votes to approve of the concepts of the optimal new revenue and no new revenue
Got it.
scenario. One map per scenario, and we'll do that. But
And if I can,
we'll
not
try to go
interrupt
to
you.
assumptions and have some discussion about this long-term strategy on dealing with revenue and expenditures.
Not to interrupt you, but I think too, when you're looking at the core, you're not just saying all of Pinellas County, if you have this much ridership or more, you're included in the core. I mean, I think it depends on the area. You know, good and bad ridership in St. Pete is different from good and bad ridership in North County. So I think And I'm not gonna make a value judgment on whatever that is, but I'm just gonna say, you have to look at that based on the land use. So that needs to be considered too. Okay, I would like to ask, we have Miss Barbara, who would like to have some public comment. Please.
Yeah, I'll just sit here.
Okay.
First of all, I say that I think you guys had a really meaningful discussion, very refreshing to hear this discussion this morning. I've always been a proponent of the core idea, and of course, you know, and I have said, do it now. Do it now, start it now, because, you know, my concern has been all along that, you know, I had a boat a few years ago. I had a 26-foot boat, and I wanted to get rid of that boat so bad. And you know what? There's no market for those 26-foot 5-year-old boats. And it comes to find out that the only way you can get rid of a boat is to buy a bigger boat. And I didn't want a bigger boat. And I got lucky. My boat caught on fire under the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, and it turned out to be a pretty good thing. Nobody got hurt, and it overheated out there, and I lost the boat, and you know, I got out of that boat. And I'm about the only person I know that ever got out of a boat. And you know, I hope we don't come to the point in Pinellas County where we say, look at this transportation system. My concern is that we are trying to save a bus system by buying a train, and that we're trying to roll what is unhealthy into just a bigger problem that's going to come back and just kill us later. And you know, this is nothing personal. I made a note here to myself to be sure and say that I'm sure that this bus system, along with every bus system in the country, started out as core. It was core. It was a small system, and people did move there if they needed to be on the bus. I can remember when I was a kid, people lived on the bus line. That was just the way you thought. If you needed to be on the bus line, that's where you lived near. So over the years, where did we get the idea that we have to take the bus to the people? The people should come to the bus. And I don't think it's hard-hearted. I think it's good common sense. And that we cannot afford to take the services to everybody's door. I wanted to throw out also the idea of DART, and did the calculation in this core, or the coverage for that matter. If you reduce the coverage, do you not dramatically decrease the obligations under the DART program and all the expenses incurred in that? Now you don't have 3/4 of a mile obligation with all these hundreds or possibly thousands of miles around the county. I mean, it's just common sense. And so I just say to you that I wanted to bring up the DART because that didn't get discussed.
That's a good point, I didn't think of that.
And if you reduce all these neighborhood coverage and all of the, you know, you're just really bringing in all this liability, all of this cost, and you can have a stellar system. And the truth is that what we're doing, we have all these people, all of us, we're going to be gone. So the decisions that we're making, and the people that made the decisions 15 years ago and 10 years ago, they should have been doing bus studies all along. We wouldn't be in this mess of you know, feeling like that we're going to be guilty if we cut the thing back to be efficient. This is just, so that's all I had to say, and I thank you for the time to say that.
Thank you, Barbara, and I didn't think about the DART aspect of it. I would have eventually, but I think that's a point. I did want to just make one comment, and that is that I think in whatever revenue scenario we do end up with, whether it's the no new revenue or the new revenue or whatever, I think it's really important that we as planning and the finance and group and the PSTA board continue to go towards some version of the core, whatever the money is, and that it is an efficient system focused on, you know, that we blew it up and started over again to the best of our ability, without,
Yeah.
well, I'll just say that. I mean, and I know that there'll be some variation on that because it is a public transportation system. But we have to gain the confidence level of the public, and even if we were not a public entity, if we were a business, a private business, I'd say the same thing. You've got to do it. When I worked for Patchington and we had 70-some stores, I watched it go from 70 stores to 20-some stores. Why? Because those were the highest performing stores. And that was 10 years ago, and they still have those same stores. And they have a whole new model for adding a store now, because they blew the system up and took what was really working well and used that as their formula. And so whatever amount of revenue we have to do that. Okay, so are we in consensus that if it comes up, that we'll say we're in consensus of leaning to the core? Is that appropriate?
Yeah.
To you all? Bill, you good with that?
Yeah.
In case they ask me to say what the planning, I'll say the two things were that we were leaning towards the core as a philosophy, and that we wanted more information on assumptions.
Perhaps with your note that maybe by the time you see this, and again, you're going to see the other scenarios at the same time, that I think it's really saying the same thing as what you just said, leaning to the core, but you're supportive of adopting the bus study recommendations to streamline routes, go to a network approach with the grid, focusing on a set of core routes and then other routes as a whole concept for PSTA. It's kind of what you described, blowing up the system and starting over with the recommended.
With whatever money we have.
Yeah, yeah.
So whether it's new
It's that.
scenario or no new scenario.
Rather than just hack away at our current system
Right,
and leave it kind of as is.
because there would be no point of doing the bus study. That would have been a worthless amount of money, and I think it wasn't worthless.
Yeah.
I think it was great. Okay. If